Thanks for coming so much. It's great to have you in our audience today and on this beautiful Berkeley afternoon. I'd like to thank the panelists for making the way to Berkeley to talk about Bystander and Altruism. My name is Dr. Keltner. I am the director of the Greater Good Science Center and a professor of psychology here at UC Berkeley. And we're delighted to have our second annual Greater Good release discussion, community discussion. The Greater Good Science Center is an interdisciplinary science center here at UC Berkeley that involves 7 or 8 different departments. And we promote the scientific understanding of why people are good, looking at biological and cultural factors that promote altruism and compassion. We are beginning in the initial stages of a project looking at how to cultivate compassion in young kids with particular kinds of curricula and educational materials. And then our third big focus is to disseminate these ideas and engage a broad community, social scientists, biological scientists, people working in journalism, around the topics of altruism and compassion and gratitude and the topics that are of interest. So that is really the inspiration for today's panel. So we're delighted that you're here. We'd also like to thank the School of Journalism and in particular one of our advocates, Deirdre English, and the Felker Magazine program. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our editor of Greater Good, Jason Marsh.
Thanks, Decker. So thank you all as well for coming, and thanks again to the Journalism School, and especially Deirdre English and the Felker Magazine program for having us here. Thanks as well to our panelists, who I will introduce in a second. I wanted to say part of the reason for our celebration here this evening is to commemorate the latest issue of the magazine, but also to recognize the fact that Greater Good is now expanding into a quarterly magazine with increased circulation, thanks in large part to the generosity of the Herb Alpert Foundation in California, as well as Tom and Ruth Ann Hornaday, who have supported us really from the start. So our latest issue, as many of you know, the magazine is about the science of altruism and compassion and empathy. And our latest issue kind of takes a different spin on those topics, looking at, given the human potential for altruism, why is it that we fail to realize that potential? And what are the social and psychological factors that often prevent us from acting on our own better moral instincts? Why is it that we serve as bystanders, essentially, to crises, big and small, that we witness? So we're actually quite lucky this evening to have a panel that can help us answer that question, or at least address it as well as anyone, both in terms of the research and in terms of some of its practical implications, particularly in the field of journalism. So without further ado, our panel, to my right is Zeno Franco, who is a PhD candidate in psychology at the Pacific Graduate University and the recipient of a 3-year fellowship, Department of Homeland Security fellowship. Zeno contributed an essay to our latest issue on the banality of heroism, which he co-authored with Phil Zimbardo, to his right. And that's really a reflection of some of their ongoing work on the topic. And to his right is Phil Zimbardo, who is, as many of you may know, a professor emeritus of psychology at Stanford University, past president of the American Psychological Association, 2-time past president, is that right, Phil?
Western Psychological.
2-time past president of Western Psychological Association. You may know him or recognize him from the PBS series Discovering Psychology, when he's deemed the voice and image of modern psychology as a result of his appearance in that program. Over the span of his career, has covered a wide range of subjects, prisons, shyness, but has come back many times to the social and situational determinants of human behavior, perhaps most memorably through the Stanford Prison Experiment, which is now 36 years old, but no less relevant and significant today than it was then, as Phil will explain shortly. So Phil's latest project, one of his latest projects, is on heroism, the subject of his and Zeno's essay. He's also the author of a forthcoming book, which will be out in about 2 weeks, called The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil, which will cover a lot of the material that he'll discuss this evening, and much more. And finally, to my left is Ted Jackson, who is a photojournalist, staff photographer with the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and has been on staff there for 23 years. And Ted has, in 1997, was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for a look. What's the name of the series? Oceans of Trouble, which looked at the impending collapse of the world's fisheries. More recently, of course, the Times-Picayune staff as a whole was honored with 2 Pulitzers for their coverage of Hurricane Katrina. Ted contributed a photo essay to the latest issue of Greater Good, Eye of the Storm, which offers some of the stories behind the photos that he took in the immediate aftermath of Katrina. So first I wanted to turn to Phil and Zeno for a bit and talk about some of their work. Phil in particular, I mean, people know you, your name is more or less synonymous with the prison experiment and the psychology of evil. And so it may catch people by surprise to hear that you're also now taking on a project on the psychology of heroism, or the banality of heroism, as opposed to the banality of evil. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the metamorphosis or the transition from an understanding of the psychology of evil, and how that could even begin to inform an understanding of what actually prompts people to serve as heroes and to do good.
Good, okay. For the past 40 years, I have been observing good people engaging in evil deeds. More accurately, for the past 40 years, I have been responsible for putting good people in situations that seduce them into behaving evilly. My first research was really an experimental follow-up of William Goulding's Lord of the Flies, the main theme of which is, by making someone anonymous and giving them permission to be antisocial, you unleash antisocial behavior. And so we did research where we took normal college students, females, made them anonymous, and then put them in a situation where they were encouraged to stress other women under a suitable guise, a cover story. It's like the big lie, like national security is now. And in that context, we observe good women very quickly behaving in evil ways, harming other women, and then we replicated that study in many different ways. So essentially, anything that makes someone anonymous, anything that makes you surrender your identity in a situation where you have permission to behave in antisocial ways or violently or aggressively. In that setting, you suspend your morality and you are a different person. So the Lord of the Flies, in fact, does work, not only in fiction but reality. The Stanford prison study was really a follow-up to the Milgram famous Yale studies. As a side note, Stanley Milgram and I were high school classmates at James Monroe High School in the Bronx. And so his study and the prison study are bookends on the power of the situation. What his study shows is that individual authority can mold individuals to blindly obey instructions to harm an innocent other person, again, within the context, a suitable semantic context in which aggression is really helping. You're really a teacher helping a student learn, but in fact, you are an aggressor punishing somebody who's a helpless victim up to a level where it potentially could be lethal. The Stanford prison study is really a study of the power of an institution, like prisons, like schools, like asylums, like any institution, certainly like the military, to come to dominate individuals through a variety of social, psychological processes, like dehumanization and role-playing and conformity and group dynamics and so forth and so on. So they are the extremes. So one is the power of an authority over an individual. My study is the power of an institution over a large number of individuals. In the course of doing these studies, what happens is the majority of people, that it's relatively easy to seduce a majority of ordinary good people to do these bad things. My definition of evil is exercising the power to intentionally harm psychologically, hurt physically, or in the extreme destroy mortally and spiritually other people. And in fact, our fascination with evil really stems not from the consequences, not from the bad output, really stems, I believe, from our fascination with power. And it's the power to dominate, it's the power to control other people. And we're more fascinated, the more creative it is, the more unique it is, and the more raw and total it is. But in the Stanford prison study, when it got worse and worse and worse, the study was supposed to go for 2 weeks, and after a very short time, these good boys, and I should mention for those of you who don't know, is we went to great lengths to pick 24 college students who were the most normal, most healthy that we could find in 1971, giving a battery of psychological tests, clinical interviews. And so we began our prison with only good apples, and we knew that. And then we flipped a coin and say, you be a guard, you be a prisoner, you be a guard, you be a prisoner. So on day one, there was no difference in the students randomly assigned to play these two roles. And on day 5, there was no similarity. Not a single measure was similar. That the guards over time became more and more sadistic, more and more brutal, more and more arbitrary. And the prisoners over time became more and more broken. In fact, we had to release 5 prisoners with having emotional breakdowns in an experiment where kids are playing cops and robbers. They're having emotional breakdowns. And the one who didn't break down began to behave like zombies. The study was supposed to go 2 weeks. I ended after 6 days because, in retrospect, of a very heroic deed by one of your Berkeley professors who had just gotten a job, first job. Our study was done in summer. She had just got hired in the psych department at Cal. It was going to begin in September. And I asked her to come down to look at my prison. I was the prison superintendent, which was a big mistake, as well as the principal investigator. And what she saw was boys lined up with bags over their heads, chained feet, counting, marching up and down, the guards verbally abusing them. And I said, hey, Chris, look at that. Isn't that interesting? And she ran out in tears. I ran after her, and I'm yelling, what kind of woman reaction is that? Don't you see the crucible of human behavior? And she said, it's terrible what you're doing to those boys. They're not prisoners. They're not subjects. They are boys, and you are responsible. What you're doing is terrible. In fact, we had just started dating, and she said, if that's the real you, rather than the kind, generous person I thought you were, it's over. It was a slap in the face, and I said, you're right. And so I ended the study because of that provocation. I should say, before looking at the hero of Abu Ghraib, that more than 50 people came down. Prison chaplain, public defender, parents came down for visiting night. Police, psychologists were in parole boards. All of these people came down, and they didn't see that, but they saw these terrible things. And what people said, gee, it's very realistic. It's really realistic simulation. And she was able to say, no, it doesn't matter if it's realistic. It doesn't matter if it's the behavior, human behavioral context. It's bad, and you are responsible for doing this. And so Christina Maslach is really a hero in that sense. We like to think of heroes as people who, our traditional view of heroes is the physical, the courageous hero. But Zeno and I argue in the article and in other things we are working on, that to be a hero is somebody who makes a sacrifice. And it could be a sacrifice of your career. In this case, I was her main advisor. Sacrifice of a potential romantic relationship, etc. And essentially it was, she said, I had to do the right thing. What was happening was immoral. Well, 40 years later in Abu Ghraib, we had soldiers who were recreating the Stanford prison study in the basement of Tier 1A in that prison in Iraq. And what was happening is, my argument is, good apples were put in a very evil place. Much like the Stanford prison study, I've investigated all the things that happened, and every process that went on in our study was there only to end power. And in a very short time, these good soldiers, men and women, were abusing prisoners, in some cases exactly like in our study. Nakedness in both, bags over the heads in both, games of sexual degradation happened in our study in Abu Ghraib, and the worst abuses in both happened on night shift because there was least surveillance, least oversight. They waited till I went to sleep because it was only me and 2 graduate students doing the whole study, day and night. And in Abu Ghraib, there was a hero just like Christina Maslach. His name was Joe Darby, the most ordinary person in the world. People in his hometown were furious that he's a hero because they said he's like a nothing. He's like the most ordinary person. His heroic deed was his buddy, Charles Grainer, Corporal Grainer, gave him a CD with thousands of these pictures that the soldiers took of their fun and games. Some of these you've seen, piling prisoners naked in a pyramid, having prisoners simulate fellatio or masturbate, or the guy with the hood with his arms outstretched with electrodes, and he thought that if he fell off that box, that he was in a stress position, he'd get electrocuted. Well, those CDs had made the rounds. They were on screensavers in a lot of the soldiers. And so the first thing is, how come none of the higher-ups knew about that, or presumed they knew about it, and it was no big deal? Well, Joe Darby looked at this and said, this is terrible, this is immoral. And what he did was, he brought the CD to a senior criminal investigator, which is a huge act in the military. He's a private in the Army Reserve. That's the lowest form of animal life in the military. Private in the Army Reserve, in the military police, in the basement of Abu Ghraib. And he says, I had to do something to stop it. And doing that stopped it. Heroic deeds of a whistleblower usually mean some recrimination. Typically, you might even lose your job. He could have lost his life. And in fact, he was in protective custody, along with his wife and along with his mother, for 3 years, because everybody wanted to kill him and kill them. Guys in his outfit, but even the people in his hometown, because they said he was the messenger that brought the message that the Bush administration and the military were doing these horrible things. Okay. So for me, I began with those examples. I began to think, enough of evil. I've been in this for 40 years. I've been creating. I'm not only observing, creating, right? And so I began to think, well, what goes into making somebody a hero? Well, what's similar about Joe Darby and Christina Maslach, although they're miles apart on every other dimension, is that they are one-time, first-time heroes. And in fact, when Zeno and I began to look at whatever literature there is on heroes, most heroes are heroes of the moment. That is, their heroic deed, there's no history of it. There's no background. They're not people who are special in any way. And they do this deed. And typically, there's not a second one for the rest of their life. And indeed, when you interview them, or when people they are interviewed, they always say it was nothing special. It was no big, I did what I had to do. In fact, recently in New York, this African-American construction worker who jumped on the subway tracks when somebody fell off, had a seizure, while 75 other people watched. Afterwards, he said, I did what I had to do. And then the important thing for us, he said, I did what everybody else should have done. But they didn't. So I call the people who, so my sense is that in the Stanford Prison Study in Abu Ghraib, there were 3 kinds of people. There were perpetrators of evil. Those in that situation get seduced by all of these powerful situational forces. Typically, what makes them work are the good guards, the ones who never do an evil deed, but they are guilty of the evil of inaction. They look the other way. Their smile is always taken as tacit approval. It was true at Abu Ghraib. There were medics, there were nurses, there were doctors who came down, who saw these horrible things taking place. In many cases, they had to write death certificates. Not that these soldiers killed them, but the CIA did. They had to write reports about physical brutality. So they knew what was going on, and they looked the other way. And then the third group are the heroes of the moment. So I want to argue that situations can work in 2 totally different ways. Situations can inflame the hostile imagination, can inflame the worst in us, and move us toward being perpetrators of evil. On the other hand, for some people, they don't move in that direction, but they don't move. and that passivity is a kind of evil when action is called for. And then we don't know why, and we've looked at all the literature. There's virtually no literature on the psychology of heroism. The most important studies are studies done of Christians who helped the Jews during the Holocaust. Nobody thought to ask the question, did anybody help, for 20 years later. And so what you get is data which is flawed by retrospective memory 20, 30 years later. And so there's very little literature. I'm saying, well, how could that be? I mean, here's all this literature on evil in various ways, and I think, well, it's the same thing. Same thing with the evening news. For any little good item that's in, we're overwhelmed with 20 of the negatives. I mean, goodness doesn't sell, and goodness doesn't trigger the human imagination the way it should. And I think that's what Daka and Jason are doing with this magazine in the center. So let me conclude with saying, many of you know Hannah Arendt's concept, the banality of evil. The banality of evil really is a situational analysis of evil, although she didn't have that concept at that time. She observed in the trials of Nuremberg, these Nazi henchmen, particularly Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was the architect responsible for all of the detailing of the deaths of more than 2,000 Jews, setting up all the efficiencies of transport and gassing and the crematorium and so forth. And he was interviewed by psychiatrists, by other people, and what she said was, everything that we see of this guy says that before he went to Auschwitz, he was normal. Now, outside of Auschwitz, her phrase is, he was terrifyingly normal. And she said, and that's what's frightening about evil. It's the banality of evil, that these evildoers are not monsters like in comic books in the movie. They are like your next door neighbor. You cannot distinguish them. Well, but when he was in the situation Auschwitz, where he had this total power, where there was an ideology of the final solution, where he had all the support, where he had the camaraderie of the other soldiers, he was transformed in a way I argue that happened in Stanford Prison Study, a way I argue happened in Abu Ghraib. Well, is it possible to flip that concept to have a concept of the banality of heroism? Monsters come in two forms. They are the people who are lifelong monsters, okay? Idi Amin, Hitler, Stalin, maybe Chairman Mao, maybe Saddam Hussein. But there are people who, over an extended period of time, fit my definition, they use their power intentionally to harm, to hurt, to destroy. But they are the exception. We know them because they make the news, because they had the power to get other people to do these terrible deeds. Most villains are villains of the moment. Most villains, most people who do evil deeds only do it, like Eichmann, in a particular situation. When they're a guard in the Stanford Prison Study, when they're military police in Abu Ghraib, when they are in My Lai. And I argue heroism is the same thing. There are lifelong heroes. You can call them chronic heroes. Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi. Their whole life is organized around sacrifice, around devotion to a cause. But they are the exception among heroes. They are extraordinary people who did extraordinary deeds. Most heroes are like Joe Darby, or like Christina Maslach, or like the guy in the New York subway who jumped on the tracks. They are heroes of the moment. And the argument we try to make is we're trying to democratize heroism, to take those generals off the bronze statues and say, we are all heroes in waiting. That is, the heroic act is an extraordinary act. The heroic act is our ordinary people. And that any of us really is a hero in waiting. Any of us has the potential in a given situation to take the third path. Path to the left is you're going to become a perpetrator. Path to the right, you're going to become a passive person guilty of the evil of an action. And the path to the center means you're going to not behave that way, not be passive. You're going to take an action. You cannot be a hero without taking an action. You have to get mobilized towards some cause, toward knowing that you're going to sacrifice life, limb, or, in some cases, your pursuit of happiness to help some person, to help some cause. And so the banality of heroism, I think, tries to rescue the concept of heroism from the super comic heroes, the Superman, the Batman, the hero program on television now, where kids watch and they say, that's really fascinating, it could never be me. Now you want to say, no, it could be you. And the argument we're trying to make in the greater good is that it's by instilling the idea that of the heroic imagination, that by imagining that there will come a time in your life, in a particular situation, where you're going to be called upon to act heroically, and thinking of yourself as a hero, we know from lots of other things in psychology, increases the probability in that situation, at that moment, you will take action when other people don't. So situations, on the one hand, can inflame the hostile imagination. We want to argue that in the same situation, for some people, it can inspire the heroic imagination.
So if I can jump in there.
Okay, that's it.
Perfect. Zeno, actually, when we talk about, I mean, as Phil has shown, the incredible power of situations to sort of coerce people into committing evil crimes, doing evil things they may not otherwise do, but recognizing the potential to not only not do evil, but even potentially to act as a hero, and seeing examples, Joe Darby, Christine Maslach, and many others, we still have to confront the fact that all too often people aren't. For every Wesley Autry, the guy who jumps onto the New York City subway, there are dozens and dozens of people who are standing idly by, don't really know what to do. So following up just on Phil's point right there, how do you then begin to try to cultivate the heroic imagination, to try to take whatever measures possible to try to ensure that more people might be able to follow in their footsteps?
Grab this thing. Yeah, I think those are all great questions. I think let me just back up for a second, if I can, and try to make this real. And let's bring it into the room for just a moment. Have any of you experienced heroism? Have you seen somebody do something heroic? And just think about that for a moment. Acts of heroism happen on university campuses all the time. I can tell you because the right.
And so I actually rejected the word hero.
Right. And a lot of heroes do, right? A lot of people that we call heroes then say to us, or say to the press, really, but I'm not a hero, I just did what I had to do. But I in a sense, I just want you to hold the question for a moment. Have you experienced heroism in your life? Has somebody done something heroic? Have you seen something heroic done? Or have you witnessed a moment when heroism could have been done and wasn't? And I think a lot of us have seen that as well. So to get back to your question, Jason, I think if we think about that, then we have to think about how do we foster this heroic imagination. And we can call it whatever we want. It might just be doing the right thing in a given situation. As I've done this research, as I've looked at what heroism is, and we can kind of distill some of these things down into a few key variables or factors, if you like, and we can get into that in a little bit. But as I've looked at this question, one of the things that's been really dramatic is that the definition of heroism has changed over time. The definition of heroism before World War I was considerably different than it is after World War I. And part of the reason is that as wars have progressed, we've become increasingly mechanized in the way we conduct them, right? So people who went to World War I and had this ideal, this military ideal of what heroism was, fought, they died. The carnage that they experienced there was like nothing they had experienced before. And so warriors, soldiers, the general public became less inclined to sort of subscribe to this idea or this ideal of heroism, okay? And that war represented a dramatic change in our history. And I think we're also at a moment of dramatic change as well. And in this case, it's not maybe because of war, but because of the sort of progression toward a digital society. And so I think of heroism in a lot of different ways. I think of it in terms of patriotism. That's one of the ways I think about it. And I was talking to a fairly liberal friend of mine the other day, and he kind of backed off when I used that word. And I think of patriotism as somebody who defends the Senate, somebody who defends democracy. I kind of have that view of it. The conservatives may have kind of a view of what we would think of as being more nationalistic. But the word patriot actually comes from the Greek, patrios, okay, of our fathers. It's a reach back in history to understand where we come from. And I think that to foster heroism, one of the things that Dr. Zimbardo talks about is the importance of time perspective and reminding people to focus on the future consequences of their actions. Okay, that's one way to prevent evil from happening. Another way to prevent evil from happening is to reach back, to think about things the way our forefathers or our foremothers thought about them, and to understand what a code of honor means, what a code of honor is. And one of the things that's really interesting to me, one of the heroes that we look at in the paper that we're hoping to get published, another paper, we look at a number of different heroes. One of them is Nathan Hale, a spy, the first US spy, who was executed by the British. And it's said that at his death he said, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." Well, did he come up with that on the spot? No, he didn't. Actually, it comes from a play by Joseph Addison called Cato, okay? The people that were revolutionaries in this country studied this play extensively. George Washington put this play on in the middle of that terrible winter, even though the political leaders around him had asked him not to put the play on because they needed resources for other things or whatever. This play was put on. These people reached back to understand what a definition of heroism was that could guide their behavior as they encountered something which they might have to, something for which they might have to sacrifice everything. And I think that's one of the key things about heroism that we want to say is that one of the components of heroism, and this is what differentiates it from altruism, is that it requires the potential for tremendous sacrifice. It doesn't necessarily mean that that sacrifice is going to be exacted, but there is the potential for tremendous personal sacrifice, whether that's in the social realm or whether that's in the physical realm. Okay? So as we think about where we're headed as a society, I think it's incredibly important for us to think about the definition of heroism. And heroism has come to mean something much more watered down than I think it should. And that is, we have people saying that heroism is being a good sports figure and not messing up too badly. Okay? We have people who are saying that heroism is being a great teacher. And being a great teacher is indeed something that we want to promote. But is that heroic? Well, in some of our schools it may be. Okay? Right? If we water down the definition of heroism too much as we move from sort of the post-World War I, World War II era into this new digital era, I fear that we will have lost something fundamental to what it is to be human. And I think that that's sort of the question, is what definition, what of our fathers and our mothers do we want to carry forward into the digital age? And every generation has to make choices about what's important and what we hope to forget. We hope to forget discrimination. We hope to forget poverty. But what are the positive things from the generations before us? So, just to kind of finish up on that thought, these things are not culturally bound necessarily. The Code of the Samurai is another code of honor. There's some really good things in here. There are a lot of different literatures that speak to this, and I think while one way of preventing evil from happening is to think about the future consequences, the flip side of that is to look backwards.
Thanks, Zeno. Now, I'd actually like to come back to Zeno and Phil in a bit, especially open it up to questions, but I'd like to turn to Ted Jackson now as well. Some of you may know Ted's contribution to this issue as a photo essay, which illustrates some of his own experiences and some of the photos that he took in the immediate aftermath of Katrina. And Ted, like all journalists, is in sort of an interesting position for when you consider the question of the bystander, in that journalists in a lot of cases are paid to be bystanders and not intervene. And it's not necessarily their job and can even hinder their ability to do their job. But of course, as we'll see with Ted, that was a fairly difficult rule to live by when he was out covering his city right after the hurricane hit. So it actually, we have actually a few photos that Ted took, some of which were in the magazine, some of which weren't. And I would actually, it's a good one to start with, I think. Ted, I wonder if you could just tell us what was going on, where were you, and what was going on in the minutes right before you took this photo, and actually just set the stage of what day is this, what's going on in the city, and then what's going on with you, and how did you actually encounter these people?
Well, this is this picture was shot Monday morning after the storm blew through. Actually, the storm is still blowing through at this point, and I wish I knew exactly what the wind speed was, but it was still hurricane force. And I had ventured out of the newspaper office with my cameras. I just get really itchy, you know, spending the night at the newspaper with other journalists. And as a photographer, you feel like you need to get out and see the wind blowing, you know, as in part of your pictures to show the storm. And so that morning, as soon as I felt it was safe, I grabbed my cameras and went running down the steps. And my publisher was coming up the steps, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to try to get out of the storm." And it was real funny. Ashton Phelps said, he closed his ears and said, "I don't want to know where you're going." And, but I headed out, and I was able to get to the Superdome, see the roof blown off, and the St. Louis Cathedral had survived, and the cell phones weren't working, so I had to get back to the newspaper to report back to my editors. And there again, I was the only one out. And so I brought the pictures back, and they had gotten a report that the 9th Ward was flooding. And my editor asked me, "See if you can get out there." And so I got back in my truck, and I headed back in that direction and weaved my way through. I got within about 4 blocks of the 9th Ward levee, and then the water was too deep. And so I left my truck there and waded the rest of the way to a bridge called the St. Claude Bridge, and about waist deep water.
Had the levees broken at this point?
The levees on the lower 9th Ward and the Chalmette side had broken at that point. And so I crossed the bridge, and this was the very first scene that I saw. And I looked to my right, and the levee break was actually about maybe 10 blocks behind me, but I didn't know. I didn't know where this water was coming from, if it was just blowing in from the Gulf. That's what I assumed. But this was the first scene that I spotted. And I was the only one there. Like I said, the storm was still blowing, and these women were standing there on this porch with their children. And
So I wonder if you could explain exactly where are they in relation to the top and the bottom of the house? How are they actually, how are they holding themselves up there?
okay, if you notice behind the woman in blue, the ice chest, that's the top of the door behind her. And so you have to realize that they're not standing on the porch. And what they're actually standing on is the rail of the porch. And they're balancing themselves and trying to hold themselves up. And the children, some were able to reach the rail and some weren't. And so they were teetering, trying to figure this out. And they were yelling to me for help. "Help us, please help us." And so, you know, trying to figure out what you're going to do here. And so my first option was to talk. And the wind is blowing, so we're actually screaming at each other. And I asked them, "How long have you been standing there?" Trying to assess the situation. They said, "We've been standing here for 5 hours now." And balancing themselves and holding themselves up. I said, "You need to get in your attic. You need to be in your attic." And they said, "We tried to get in the attic and it wouldn't hold us." I still never really knew what that meant, but there was no time to figure that out at the moment. And I said, "Well, you need to just hold on." And you tried to get down in the water, and it was just too deep. show the next picture real quick, we'll come back to this one. This was the distance between us, and there was a street running between us, and it's about 10 feet deep at this point. And so go back to the other one now. And I said, you have to be able to you just have to hold on. And they were concocting a plan. They were desperate, and they were ready to get off the porch. They were desperate. And so what they had done is they had caught a log that was floating by. And their plan was to put the little girl with the little barrettes in her hair, the little ball things in her hair. They were going to put her on the log, balance her on the log, and they were going to shove her across to me. And I was to catch her. And in the other picture, it's really hard to see, but this water is raging down the street. And I estimate, I'm a sailor, so I kind of guess about 5 knots or 6 knots of current, which there was just no way this little girl was going to make it. And this is another point I like to bring up when I talk about this picture, is that I don't know about Berkeley and I don't know about San Francisco, but in New Orleans and most of the South, swimming is not a normal thing for the African American population. It's not in their recreation. And so if I was standing on this porch and water was rising around me, I could attempt to swim. Or if I fell off the log coming across the street, I would try my best to swim across. But for most people in New Orleans at this moment, this is death surrounding them with very few options. And so this was one option she had, was to float her on the log to me. I didn't know this at the time, but the woman in blue at the top, the plan was to put the little girl on the left in the ice chest and to keep her floating. And I just begged them to stay where they were, that this was not good, but this was the best thing they could do, was stay where they were. And this is where it became interesting for me. I discovered that there was nothing I could do except beg them to stay. But as long as I stayed there...
Have you shot any photos
No.
yet or not?
No, we're talking and screaming. And I was trying to figure out how to shoot pictures and how to help. And thinking, there were the pictures. If I could get over to them and ferry them back and forth, get the girls across, and somehow have a camera at the same time, then this is where I wanted to be. This was perfect for everybody, but there was just no way. And so I just convinced them to had to stay where they were, but they were still convinced to get the girl across the lawn. And about that time, an older man walked up. I would put him in his 70s maybe, and he was desperate trying to help them. And I was not going to, this was my dilemma, I wasn't going to watch this little girl drown. Because the longer I stayed there, the more likely they were going to try to push her. And so I also knew that I had to shoot a picture of this situation. And so I started trying to figure out how to do this so that people wouldn't see me, so it wouldn't add to their trauma. And so I started to move away a little bit and let the man take center stage in yelling to them and talking. And he walked down into the water, down the steps like the young boys in the other picture did, and tried to get across, and he saw how deep it was in the current. So I moved away, and I started to shoot a picture, and the man saw me, and he screamed at me, and he said, "You're not shooting a picture of this." And I came back to him, and I kind of put my hand on his shoulder, and he brushed it off, and I said, "You've got to understand, this is important for the world to see. My editors need to know what's happening in the Ninth Ward, and I'm going to shoot this picture. But I'm trying to do it so that people don't, it's not adding their trauma." So I walked away again, and when people looked away, I raised the camera, and the man screamed at me again, "I see you sneaking a picture." And I yelled at him. I said, "I'm not sneaking a picture. I told you, I'm shooting a picture." And it was an ugly scene between us, you know. This guy was just violent almost. So I made a few frames, and then I came back to him, and I kind of tapped him on the shoulder again. And remember, the wind is still just screaming at us. And the quote I remember, it sounds silly now, but I told him, I said, "One day you and I are going to sit down over coffee. I'll explain why this picture is so important right now." And what I really remember is his quote back when he said, "I'll never have coffee with the likes of you." And so I just wanted to leave. I just wanted to go. And so I left, and then the kids showed up, and they were trying to get down to the water, and I shot a couple more frames, and then I left. Went back to the newspaper as quick as I could, and gave them the digital cards. And then they asked me if I would take a reporter out with me the next time, because I was along the whole time, the whole day so far. And by now it's about 1 o'clock, 1:30, something like that. And so we headed back out.
I wonder, when you first turned in these, when you gave these photos to your editor, I mean, what was the immediate reaction in the newsroom to these images?
I remember Dan Shea, our managing editor, saying, "My God, Ted's got pictures of people up to their chest in water." And it was the first images we had seen of the flooding and how bad it was. And
I want you as well to just give a follow-up to actually what happens to the people in the photo as well.
okay, I'm gonna be real quick with this part. I left out of the office building with the reporter, and I grabbed an inflatable boat and a length of rope and headed back out. And I told Tevino, the reporter, I said, "Are you okay if we have to make a choice between saving people's lives and reporting stories? We're saving people's lives first. Are you okay with that?" And he said, "Yeah, I am." And so we went back to the spot, and they were gone. And there were rescuers pulling people out of other houses, and actually there were 2 boats that I saw at that point. And I asked them if they had gotten the people on the porch, and they said, "What people on the porch? We never saw anybody there." So I just assumed that they had continued trying until everybody had drowned. And a couple months later, or thereabouts, it was Thanksgiving, and the paper decided to do a story on thanking their heroes, people who were rescued thanking their heroes. And so they wanted to do it through the photographs. And so we turned in photographs of rescues, but I turned in this one. And the reporter, through an amazing bit of reporting, was able to track this family down, and they had survived. They were rescued by, I believe, those teenagers who were able to find the boat and get them off the porch. And I was able to talk to them on the phone. They had been evacuated to Houston, to the Superdome first, and then to Houston. And I talked to her, the lady with the ice chest. I talked to her on the phone, and I said, I am so happy to know that you guys are okay. And her question was, well, the thing that we could not understand was, why did you leave us? And I said, well, you need to know that I came back with a boat and rope and the intent to get you off that porch. And so we talked for a while, and as we were hanging up, she said, if you would grant us one great favor, if we have never seen this picture, could you send us a copy of the picture? We'd like to keep it. And so that's kind of the follow-up where it ended with this family.
Yeah. So whenever, I mean, when you encounter a situation like this, and I mean, I wonder from this point forward, what kinds of rules did you establish for yourself? I mean, coming into the situation, did you already have rules about when you help, when you shoot, when you try to do both? Did any of those rules come in handy in this situation, or did this just trump everything?
I don't know that I had any cut and dried rules about how to respond to this, because it's rare that you come into something like this. I mean, we photograph tragedy all the time, but rarely are you the only one there. And like in this situation, you felt like not only were you the only one there, but you were the only one that was going to be there for a long time. And so it was just easy for me. And I think I'm certainly not the only one that did this, but I think you felt like if you had to shoot pictures or actually save a life right now, that the pictures can wait. And I hope most journalists were thinking this way, but I do know that most of the local journalists were thinking that way. I think there is a difference in someone coming into another city, and then this is happening to your own people. That there may have been a difference. I don't know that, but I did make rules after this.
What were those?
Well, there was a moment when I left the newspaper office when everybody evacuated the building, and I found a rowboat that I rowed away from the building in, and I was alone. And I rode across the parking lot, across the fence, and sat under a tree for a second, suddenly realizing that I had a boat in a city that was desperate for a boat, and I was going to meet hundreds of people who would do anything and everything to take my boat. And so what was I going to do? And I had these scenes of the lifeboats of the Titanic, you know, where people with an overloaded rowboat had to row away from people who were drowning. And so I remember youth ministry when I was a kid, my youth minister teaching us things like, make your decisions before you get in the situation, and it's easier. And so I sat there for a few minutes and made my rules. And the rule was, if they were high and dry, I was leaving them there, because I couldn't take everybody. But if they were in the water drowning, they were coming with me, that I would do everything I could to get them. And so I rode out from under the tree, and within 5 seconds, literally, no joke, there was a head bobbing in the water, and I screamed. I said, "Are you okay?" And the head turned to me and yelled out, "Ted!" And it was a fellow coworker who was swimming away from the boat.
Did you take his picture?
No, I did not.
Do you have, can you scroll ahead?
One more.
Yeah. This one, you want to go ahead?
Is the one where they're carrying the woman
Yeah, that's the next
close
one.
by?
Let's go.
Let's put that one
Let's-
for next.
One more.
No, one more.
Oops, sorry.
One more. One more. There we go. Then we'll go back to the other. This was the next day after I rode out of the building for 5 hours. I didn't shoot a single picture of all the people that I saw. I just couldn't do it. And I made the decision, if I couldn't help them, I couldn't shoot their picture. And I sort of collapsed in the middle of the interstate when I got to dry land. And I suddenly woke up. I don't know how long it was, but my senses came back to me when helicopters started landing around me, and they were bringing this woman out. And I kind of, your journalistic sense starts kicking in. You say, well, that's a picture. I should probably be shooting it. And so I grab my camera and I shoot this picture as they bring this woman who seems to be suffering from a broken hip. And they lift her over a barricade onto a gurney with wheels on it. And every time they do that, the gurney rolls away. And there's about 5 photographers around. And she would scream and they would yell, and everybody seemed to be zooming their lenses in tighter, for the drama. And I remember the paramedic, the guy yelling there, he screamed. He said, "For God's sakes, would somebody help us?" And I remember these experiences are building on me now, and I'm just so disgusted. I just slung my cameras over my shoulder and picked the woman up and put her on the gurney and then walked away. And I remember thinking, I don't want to do this anymore. I just don't want to do this anymore. I was ready just to give this up. And but then I saw another helicopter. I ran up to it. I begged for a ride, and I jumped in the helicopter. We shot aerials after that. And then go back a couple pictures.
Sorry, well, who were the other, because you mentioned before, someone in your situation who's especially covering their own city and wants to help their fellow citizens, as much as shoot a good picture. Who were the other journalists there? People from TV, were they local? Were they coming from the same place you were?
I don't know. And I wish I knew their stories. I don't want to judge them, because I've been now living this for a day and a half, and very likely they could have been the Baton Rouge television station, they could have been CNN, they could have been anybody that just showed up and this was their first picture, they needed to get something out. But I can't judge what they were thinking or going through. They were all TV though. All. But
So we have time maybe for one more quickly.
let's go to this one.
Yeah.
So when I got in the helicopter, I tried to make some decisions about how to proceed, because this was not going to work for me anymore. And I decided that I wanted to find ways that I could help and help rescue, and do both at the same time when it was appropriate. And so I found myself in rescue boats, and that way I can continue to work. And this picture was Thursday at the convention center when we heard that there was a riot breaking out. And there were several photographers that had banded together at this point for safety. And we went to the convention center and walked onto the street, and the crowd rushed us. We thought we were in a mob scene, and but actually the people were coming up to us, grabbing us, and this woman grabbed me. Angela Perkins is her name. And she grabbed me by the elbow and she says, "I've got to show you this, I've got to show you that." And she became my escort and guide through the whole place. And when we came back outside, she was so desperate, she just, as you see here, she did it twice. She collapsed down on her knees and just screamed out, "Help us, please." And she screamed it, and then she got up, and then she tried to get the crowd to start chanting it, and they did. Everybody was chanting, "Help us, help us, help us." And this was the moment where you realize that there was, if I had brought 2 truckloads of water to these people, or a truckload of food, it would not have helped them as much as this picture did. And it was the greater impact was not trying to help her out of the situation, but shooting her picture. And you realize that, she was, and the photographer and I, there was another photographer with me. We walked up on the bridge to shoot an overall of the scene, and I remember him grabbing my arm, and he stopped me and said, "Ted, can we just stop a minute and pray?" And it was a powerful moment where we were just overwhelmed by this time. So we stopped and prayed for a while. And I remember, we didn't try to put together what it was she was screaming to us. And Brett said, "I think she was screaming, 'God help us.'" And I said, "But she wasn't. As powerful as that moment was, I think she was screaming for the world to help. And she was praying through our lenses." And so that was a huge moment for both of us, realizing that.
Any questions? Yes.
I wonder if each of you could speak to what in your background led you to think about things like this, especially about thinking about the consequences of your actions, because it seems to me that today most people don't think about the consequences of their actions, and yet you all are talking about that. So I wonder if you could give a sense of what in your background gave that to you.
Okay, I think for me, right before I left Los Angeles, that's a plug right there for my home city, for graduate school, I was listening to KNX News Radio, which is the main CBS affiliate in Los Angeles. And this was not too many months after 9/11. And there was a report, and I've been talking about this particular issue on this campus. There was a report that a scientist from UC Davis was extremely concerned about the World Trade Center dust and the health effects that it might have, particularly on the responders and the construction crews, but also on the residents in that area. And what fascinated me about that particular report is I thought, here's a career scientist, an aerosols expert, who is doing something that most scientists would be kind of loath to do, which is to step into sort of the political realm and to argue for a particular outcome. And kind of being familiar with that career trajectory, I realized that he was putting a lot on the line. And I thought about that, and I thought, this man is doing something extremely courageous. He's fighting with the administration, he's fighting with the EPA, he was going through back channels with the Office of the President of the UC to try to get access to the administration. And I just was personally moved by somebody that was willing to make that sacrifice. And it can seem like a small thing. I mean, we're talking about this guy maybe getting some flack from some of his fellow scientists. But for somebody that's dedicated their entire career to that, it can be a big deal. And so, one of the aspects that we talk about in heroism is social heroism, or the risks that people take. They're not physical risks. They're not the risk of being hurt or killed necessarily, but being ostracized, losing pay, losing a job. Those are all the risks that a social hero takes. And so that's sort of how I came to it
Everything I am today, and I guess have been for most of my professional life, started in 1939 when I was 5 years old, and I was admitted to a hospital for poor children in New York who had every known contagious disease. It was called Willard Parker Hospital. And in 1939, so this was tuberculosis, and I had double pneumonia and whooping cough, and scarlet fever, and polio, and all these kids, hundreds of kids on beds. And in 1939, there was no medication. There was no penicillin, there were no sulfa drugs, there was nothing. So this was genetic roulette, meaning kids lived and kids died, and you never were allowed to get out of your bed. They didn't even have the simple concept of health that you dangle your feet. And I was in that hospital for 6 months. And because kids had diseases and were crying, and so the nurses, I remember, all had to wear masks all the time. So part of my lifelong interest in masks is always wondering who was the person behind the mask. But it meant you literally never got out of your bed. And once you got past the loneliness of whether your parents would forget you were there, because in 1939, poor people didn't have telephones. And there was no way, you never spoke to your parents. Visiting days were limited 1 day a week, 2 hours, purposefully. I've checked records from that hospital and other hospitals, and it was a standard policy of the institution. When children had to be hospitalized for long periods of time, to break the affective ties between children and parents and rearrange that between children and the institution, so that children wouldn't be crying all the time. It's a big pain in the ass, kids all crying as their mother. And of course, on Sundays when parents were supposed to come, often they didn't come because it was winter. I was there from December through Christmas, New Year's, my birthday. I got out I was paroled in Easter. Well, you know, it was a 7-block walk from the subway to this place, which is on East River Drive. My mother had 3 younger kids, and nobody could afford a cab. So there were times you got all excited, this is the 2 hours, and they never showed up. And you wouldn't know why. There was no phone call, so you assumed they forgot you. But even that horrible fear was not worse than the fear of being passive. And at some very deep level, I said to myself, if I get out, I will never be passive again. I did become a track runner. I was captain of the track team. Physically passive and also socially, physically active and socially active. And so my whole life, in every situation I'm in, I always say, A, what can I do to make other people feel special? And B, what is happening in the situation that needs improvement? And do I have the talent, do I have the skill, the energy to improve it? So I was one of the first people to be against the Vietnam War. I organized in 1965 the second teach-in against the war at NYU. I don't remember where the first one was. I led a walkout when NYU was going to give Robert McNamara an honorary degree. They have several hundred parents, students, teachers, very respectfully get up and just walk out. It actually made the front page of the New York Times. I thought it was immoral to give this architect of war who knew, we now know from his memoir, who knew the war was not winnable and kept it going for 7 years with Nixon and Kissinger. And then in the Vietnam, and then at Stanford, when I first got to Stanford, students were trashing buildings. You know, what does that have to do with the war? So I organized 2,000 students through the psychology department. We had a political action coordinator. We organized students in constructive anti-war activities. And then most recently, I'm one of the few faculty at Stanford to mobilize against, weekly, to mobilize against the Iraqi war from beginning, before its beginning and throughout. And in my book, the action I take, which my publisher is very upset, is at the end of the book, I say the following people this guy I try to defend, he got 8 years in prison. He got dishonorable discharge. They took away 22 years of his back pay as a National Guard. He's devastated, he's destroyed. He had 9 medals, and they publicly shamed him. And in my book, at the end, I say, not only can I demonstrate he was a good apple before he went there and since then, but I have a whole chapter indicating how the system was implicated in all of these things. And the system is General Miller at Guantanamo, General Sanchez at Abu Ghraib, Colonel Pappas, Colonel Jordan, and George Tenet of the CIA, because the reason, why did those abuses happen there? That was the interrogation center. That was the soft torture center in Tier 1A. That's why they happened there. And these poor military policemen, they were encouraged. They were, by the military intelligence, by the CIA, by civilian interrogators, by the Navy SEALs, to soften these detainees up for interrogation. And they tell them, take the gloves off, beat them up, do whatever you have to do. They never thought they would take pictures. So the whole thing there is not about the abuses, it's they took pictures. And it's the pictures that implicated America. So in my book, I ask readers to be the juror of each of these military people, and I describe how they're complicit. And then, of course, the complicity of George Tenet, Rumsfeld. Almost all the things that happened in Abu Ghraib were part of 8 steps that Rumsfeld have listed. We have the document: nakedness, use of dogs, stress position, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation. Those are in explicit memo from Rumsfeld down to the generals. And then also the architects of the war, Cheney and Bush, and their legal advisors. And I'm developing a website. It'll be out where we're going to have a virtual voting booth where people are going to vote. I'm going to give the description of why these people are guilty of crimes against humanity and have people vote. And again, so the minimal heroic thing is my publisher is crazed, and I'm saying it doesn't matter. I'm doing what has to be done.
Ted, you want to speak?
I have a little story that I'd like to explain that question with. It's a very interesting question, I think. But when I was first started with the Times-Picayune, this sounds a little silly right now, but I was enamored with the little walkie-talkie that they gave us. It was before cell phones. And at night, I would set it up on the counter in the kitchen, and we'd sit around the table with my wife and my 2 kids and eat our dinner and listen to the other photographers work. And one night, one of the photographers came on the radio and said, this is David, the photo desk. I need some help out here. And the editor came on and said, what you need? He said, I'm in the housing development, and I'm finished shooting my assignment. I'm going back to my car, and there's a woman who is being evicted from her apartment, and they're putting her stuff out on the sidewalk, and she's asking me for help. So I want to know if you had a pickup truck that I could move her furniture with. And the editor said, if you got the pictures, you need to get out of there. And he came back and he said, well, you don't understand, it's starting to rain and they're putting all of her stuff on the sidewalk. If nobody helps her, either the rain's going to ruin it or people are going to steal it. Somebody needs to help. Could you please ask around and see if anybody's got a pickup truck? He said, okay. So he came back in a second and he said, nobody's got a pickup truck. Get out of there. And so desperate now, David says, I can't do that. Does anybody out there have a truck? And this was interesting. And I asked for another helping of black-eyed peas, and I looked across the table to my 7-year-old son. I'll never forget this moment. My 7-year-old son has tears streaming down his face, and he said, Dad, what are you going to do? And you know, it was a stunning moment because I was a spectator. This was just sport for me. I was just listening to an interesting conversation, but he brought me down to the core of the matter. And so I started thinking a little different. I realized that we had just moved to town. We had just started going to this new church down the street, and one of the leaders of the church came to me Wednesday night and he said, Ted, you know, you're moving in, nice to have you here. If you ever need a truck to help you out, you know, give me a call. So this is not what he meant. But I called him anyway, and the 3 of us moved the woman's furniture that night. And it just helped me to focus, to realize that when you photograph subjects as your career, that the subjects have a huge stake in what you do, and to remember them and their perspective and what they're going through. And when you can help, you can. When you can't, you can't. But as an end note, the little boy that cried at the end of the table and asked me what I was going to do, he is now in the Coast Guard, who's part of the rescue guys pulling people off rooftops in New Orleans. So that's kind of a cool thing.
Are there any societies and countries that do a better job in developing heroism and compassion in their children than people?
You guys want to speak to that? Becker, do you want to speak to that?
In general, how do you use the word? In societies that are not literate, where history is passed along mostly with storytellers, part of what the storytellers do is tell heroic stories. And the heroic stories are always about great deeds that the children's ancestors did. The subtext is they want the kids to stay in that village and not go away. They want them to replace their parents and grandparents. So in many cultures where there is a heavy emphasis on ancestor worship, and it comes across through these stories, through these tales of where you're bringing the past and the present. From everything I know, this is one way, and it's not consciously we want these kids to be heroic, but it's one way to glorify the heroes who came from that culture. And I think it's with the idea of, given those models, then maybe someday you will be part of that story. But I don't know any literature on it.
There's another aspect to that, which is that not all cultures see heroism as something to be glorified. Okay, I can't remember exactly where I read this, but in the process of doing this research, we were looking at some cultural comparisons. And if you describe what heroism is in a Western sense, in other cultures, some cultures would look at that as being foolish, foolhardy, or bringing things down on, bringing things upon the community that they don't really want. So there's the definition of heroism that we have, I think, is very much an artifact of our British heritage. So that's something to think about as well.
Anything else to add? Do you want to speak to compassion as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the ways to think about how to answer that question is to look at how cultures define the good life. And there are a lot of interesting studies, like in the anthropological literature, by Kathy Letts and Lila Abu-Good, where they go to other cultures, for example, in Micronesia, and find that the idea of happiness in the good life is about giving to others. So it's built into the fabric at a much earlier life. And so we asked the question, there are recent surveys out about how our American children rank very low in terms of happiness, and that may be part of the answer. Is to think about it.
When you first brought up this,
Little louder.
And in my mind, heroism is a huge kind of word. Whereas what concerns me and Dr. Zimbardo was talking about analyzing, what makes somebody a hero. Rather, I'm thinking about what's the tipping point at which somebody, converts from being passive into getting rid of all those rules and making a new rule that says, in this situation, I'm not going to stand by and watch. And also I have a comment that we need journalists, photojournalists, and video journalists so much right now, just to show us, a version of reality other than the one that would be fed on television, all this infotainment that we get. I'm really beholden to people like you and people like Nicholas Kristoff who, show us how to care about larger things, and maybe how to be heroic, like actually care about what's happening inside for it and believe that we can make a difference.
So the initial question, is there a tipping point?
Yeah, I mean, you just saw the example with Ted.
Yeah.
So had his son not be there, had his son not been there and said that, he wouldn't have done anything. Because he had defined the situation, he was a bystander. He was listening to this stuff going on out there. And when somebody's saying, can you get a truck, that's not a message to him. Because, so again, here's how in that situation, he initially had a passive frame. because it's entertainment. You're watching, like you're watching television. Somebody on television, does anybody have a truck? You know. And his son, I'm sorry. His son forced him to change his conception of the situation in exactly the same way that Christina Maslach forced me to break through my set. And that in both cases, it was someone taking an action which forced him in his case, and me in my case, to go from being passive and distant from this. I was an observer of this horrible thing going on. He was an observer of what's happening on his little walkie-talkie, saying, no, you must take action. So what we're trying to do is to say, suppose Maslach was not there, suppose his son was not there, you know, would I be more likely, would he be more likely to take action if we had grown up in a culture that promoted that in our school? So it's not that children somehow have to, on their own, think heroically. Given, I believe, in the power of the situation, it's that it has to start in the family. It has to start in schools. I mean, it has to start with giving examples in the family of good things that your relatives did, heroic things. Or in the school, good examples of heroic deeds, rather than all the negatives of, Columbine, et cetera, et cetera. So it's individual, my whole argument, individuals change when situations change. But how do we as a community of scholars, a community of intellectuals, convince the system to begin to make changes in this positive direction, to promote greater good rather than greater evil?
Great. You can hear the chimes, which is actually signaling that we need to wrap up.
Can I just say one more thing?
But Zeno has one more thing.
One more thing.
Quickly.
Psychologists, our psychology students. I think there's one other important point. And yes, heroism is about action in certain situations. In other certain situations, it's about a different concept, of sort of passive heroism. There are a lot of different words that describe heroism, and we don't really take the time to understand what they are. One of them is fortitude. And there are situations where somebody might be presented with a problem that they can't really do anything about, but they can hold it off. And I think that that's a really important thing to say. There are times when just holding it off is heroic. And I also want to make a comment, and this kind of links to this concept, is that there are 5 gentlemen at this table, at the head table, right? There are different forms of heroism performed by men and by women, or that are easier for men and women to access. And when we were writing this, I was discussing this whole concept with my wife, and she kept saying, but that's not the whole picture. Okay? Women access heroism maybe differently, maybe the same. But I think there's one thing that women are really good at, and maybe have had to be good at, and that is fortitude. Okay? So that's something to kind of think about.
That's it.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking the panelists. I've come a long way to be with us this evening, and thanks again to the Journalism School, the Belkin Magazine Center, Deirdre English, and thank you to all of you. If you haven't already picked up a copy of Greater Good Magazine, or want to learn more about the Greater Good Science Center, there is literature in the back, and there may also be some literature about Phil's new book as well. Thanks again.
Thank you.